All right, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome to the Benjamin Dixon Show. Um, well, you know what? I'm going to let her introduce herself because I do a pretty bad job of introducing people. But I want her to come on, and I want you to welcome Rania Khalek. And I heard her on. First of all, I've been reading her tweets for a little while, and I've read her articles for a little while. But I had a chance to hear her on the Majority Report this week, and I reached out to her and told her I had to have her on the show. Rania, how are you? Thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on. It's good to be with you.
I'm sorry. I think that's my fault. Say that again. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks so much for having me on. It's really good to be with you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for joining us. So before we start talking about politics, tell everybody about yourself. Introduce yourself. I'm sure my listeners already know who you are, right? But again, I want to give you a chance to let you speak for yourself.
Well, if they don't know who I am, like you said, my name is Rania Khalek, and I am a journalist. I write for the Electronic Intifada. I typically cover issues related to Israel-Palestine, but I also write for other outlets here and there as well.
I like your bio on Twitter. You said you're a journalist with an opinion. And, I appreciate that candor because I think people fail to realize, or not people, I think journalists fail to realize that in some capacity, they do have an opinion. So, what made you say that? Do you run into that often where you're expected to not have an opinion?
Well, I mean, I think journalists in general are expected to not have opinions. It's sort of the mainstream idea of what journalism means. But I am totally opposed and reject the idea of objectivity. I don't think it's possible to be objective on a number of issues. I think it's natural to have biases and opinions, and I prefer to be honest about that instead of pretending to not have one. And I also think being objective oftentimes ends up serving power because you end up, instead of just telling your viewers or listeners or readers what the facts are, it ends up being this game of he said this and she said that, and I'm just going to leave it to you to decide because I just want to stay objective and neutral. And there's some issues you just can't be neutral on.
I'm trying to think who I was reading this week that actually made that point so clear. There's an entire piece about it, or maybe it was a series of tweets where they were discussing how this position of neutrality actually is not really tenable when you're dealing with certain issues. And they brought up the example of NPR, right, where NPR tries to give both sides of or tries to make it seem like there's two valid sides of an argument, and then when they're done, it's kind of a wash. And I have to find out who that was because everything you just said reminded me of that, which is why I have a lot of respect for journalists, but I'm glad to be doing commentary because I have so many opinions. I don't think I can make it a day.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's no. I think there's certainly a place definitely for straightforward reporting that's important. But when it comes to issues like climate change, for example, and that's one thing that like you mentioned, NPR and other news outlets did for a really long time. They do it less now, but they used to treat the climate deniers as though they had valid opinions when 99% of scientists say that climate change is real. And so the issues like that, it skews the way that the public ends up viewing very, very serious and important issues. You have like a significant portion of the public that believes climate change isn't real because they're being told by people that are being presented as people with serious opinions that it isn't. And so, yeah, that's where it starts to be very dangerous, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was the quintessential example for me. And then we're going to talk about politics in a second. This is politics. We'll talk about the race in a second. But the quintessential example for me was when I was listening to NPR and they were doing an interview with Ted Cruz, and they allowed Ted Cruz to use the fact that his mother was a scientist as justification for him opposing NASA climate data and dismissing NASA climate data as something that was wrong. And he was right because his mother was a scientist. And at that point, I just threw my hands up. I'm like, come on, God. You can't try to be that unbiased that you can leave something like that hanging in midair. So I think it's a perfect example. But yeah,
a huge reason why the right has been able to make a lot of the arguments that it's made for the past couple decades is because they've been treated, some of their ridiculous and most absurd arguments have been treated as legitimate by the sort of like, we have to treat both sides equally frame of thinking.
Yes. Absolutely. Great. That was a bonus. That was for free. I didn't realize we could have that conversation. That's a clip by itself. Great commentary there. Let's talk about the race.